And we're live. Hello, everybody. I'll do my usual. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world, and welcome to this Monday's This Is Not Therapy Hour. My name is Marie. I'm an executive functioning coach. I work in association with Effective Artistry, and I'm joined as ever this week and every week by Brandon Tessers, LCPC and Clinical Director of Effective Artistry's neurodiversity affirming therapy practice based in Northbrook, Illinois, working as the title of the show goes. This is not therapy. It's just an open conversation and questions of Brandon. And I will occasionally step in and take the place of the audience and ask questions on your behalf. So if you have any thoughts you'd like on university, coaching, mental health, things like that, you're free to pop a message in the chat and I'll ask that question or place a comment on.
Shoot, Marie, your connection is a little.
Can you hear me?
I do, but you're going in and out. I'm lowering the visual resolution. Maybe that'll help with the connection. But we'll see.
Okay.
And if people have anything, let us know. We'll do our best. But yeah.
Can you hear me better now?
Yes.
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing all right. We might have a little bit of, we're out of sync, but hopefully it'll catch up. So if we're stumbling over each other, interrupting each other, we'll just have to help each other out with that.
All right. So yeah, as I said, this is not therapy. If you're here with us in the chat, feel free to ask questions of Brandon. I'll put them to Brandon on your behalf. Last week we were talking about the topic of accommodations in education. And so we said we'd pick that up again this week because Brandon, you wanted to offer some practical suggestions of how parents, carers can approach the issue of applying for and getting accommodations for young people in education.
Yeah. So
I'm trying to remember where we left week. I think we talked about IEPs and 504s, am I right? Individual education plans and is it 504s?
Yeah, 504, they're like behavior plans, basically. Yeah. I don't remember totally where we left off and what we were talking about. I didn't go back and relook at it or anything like that. I do remember we were. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah. So. Oh no, go for it.
No, I don't remember much. I was just gonna ramble until we found something. But if you've got any memory or questions or whatever, I know something came up at the end is what I was saying, that somebody was asking questions and we kind of switched over to talking about that. So I don't remember where we got to with the educational accommodation stuff.
Yeah, so I think that is where we left off. You wanted to talk about practical suggestions.
Sorry, you're cutting out again.
An interesting thing came up on social media this week you find it hard to hear me?
I'm hearing you okay, it's stuttering every once in a while. So, but go ahead. I heard you were starting to say something about there was something on social media.
Something came up on social media yesterday that might be worth talking about as well, which was this idea that kids don't have a hard time at school or preschool, that they don't hold it all in until they get home. This was a comment that was made by a expert who has or had a TV show. Autistic people talked about how actually they were very well behaved and they
I'm sorry, Can we try turning off your video and see if your audio will come through smoothly if it doesn't have to do that?
Yeah.
Much as I
All right.
would rather be able to see you, it's more important to me to be able to hear what you're saying. Sorry, you said some expert of some kind made a comment that kids don't struggle in preschool.
Made a comment that the idea, that the idea that children hold it in or mask in any way until the end of the school day wasn't true. And there was quite a bit of a response from the autistic community on Twitter sharing their experiences. So I guess this kind of ties into getting a diagnosis in the first place, or getting an education plan in place for a child who may not display any kind of outward signs of being neurodivergent or having additional support needs in the classroom, but whose parents are picking up on something that's happening at home. So a lot of people were saying, when I was at school, I managed to hold it in all day. I felt really uncomfortable, but I was quiet and shy and reserved. But then I would go home and have a meltdown. And that went on for years until it was discovered that autistic or ADHD or whatever. So I wonder if there's any advice you can give to parents or caregivers who are seeing some kind of manifestation of neurodivergence or difficulties at home, but whose teachers are saying, no, they're very, very well behaved at school and there's no problems here.
What kind of expert was this?
Can you insist on? Pardon?
Who was the expert? What's their expertise? I'm curious.
They had I'm afraid to name them. So
it was someone from like the education field or psychology field?
Childcare, and they had a show where they would teach parents how to get their kids to behave a little bit better. We'll put it that way, from a behavioral perspective.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm trying to parse some of it.
We could talk about that all day.
So here's the thing. I don't like the phrasing of "hold it in," because that implies that melting down is a choice, right? That like I would be melting down all day long, but I hide it, then I choose to unleash the melt. And neither, you wouldn't be melting down all day long. What is happening, autistic or ADHD or not or whatever, is we're being asked to do something, and whether you're a preschooler or a kindergartner or an adult, whatever, we're being given the impression that if we are to do X, that people would be happier, possibly and frequently happier with us specifically, but just generally it would make them happier if we do X than if we do anything other than X. If X is something that's like a natural default thing that we do, that's not very effortful necessarily, although there's still effort involved in like reading that somebody wants it from you, because that's a task that requires resources. And there's nothing weird or bad about that. That's how humans are. We try to, even because I think some people might have a tendency to look at that and say, oh, how terrible that these kids are being given the impression that they should do this, or that they'd be better off if they do that, or that the people around them would be happier if they did this other thing, whatever. That's inevitable. That is just what it is to interact with other people. Even the people who would say that that's a bad thing, they themselves care about what helps other people and makes other people happy, right? Like we wouldn't be getting involved in saying, we wouldn't have an opinion on how children should be treated if we didn't care about what can be done to make people happier and have a more enjoyable and pleasant experience generally, right?
Yeah.
So if what you're being asked to do is not something that just you do automatically by default, then it takes some amount of resources to do that thing, and those resources get drained. And there are things that can be done that will be done eventually to replenish those resources. So what's happening, it's not that someone is holding it in, it's that they're doing their best to do everything that they're being asked to do. And there are reasons that it's very valuable, maybe even more valuable. And sometimes that does get into the negative side of things where they're not feeling as safe at school. And so even if it is, more than you can really afford to do without having, like, we can pull an all-nighter, right? If necessary, if the stakes are high enough, we can make ourselves stay up all night. It's not enjoyable. We pay for it later on, but we can do it. So we have all these abilities to push ourselves beyond what is comfortable or sustainable, because sometimes it is worth doing that, even though you pay the cost later. So there are patterns for sure where kids are getting into the place where they're pushing themselves beyond what is sustainable every day at school, and then collapse when they get home because they have nothing left to give. And they finally, it's like, oh, I made it back to a safe place. Or just like, oh, okay, I made it through finals week and I'm going to just sleep for 4 days now or whatever, right? So if that's part of what she's trying to get at, is like, no, they're not holding it in, because I would agree with that statement, because that would imply that preschoolers are, going through the complex, like, mental algorithms of, okay, better for me to hide things here, even though I know it will mean that I'm going to have a meltdown later. I think it's unlikely that most kids that age are thinking of it in that way. Most adults don't think of it that way, right? Like, most adults who struggle, like, I don't know, I never can get myself to go to bed on time, or I'm not working on my art at night even though I want to be, or I want to hang out with friends, but I don't know, it makes me uncomfortable, or I don't have the energy to, or whatever. Don't typically jump straight to, well, I'm probably pushing myself too hard during the day, and by the time the night rolls around, I have nothing left to give. So I wouldn't expect that most preschoolers or kindergartners are doing that either. But it is obviously observably true that children will follow the rules and hold to expectations and put forth great effort to, like, do what they're asked to do and behave how they're asked to behave during the school day, and then get home and it falls apart. So whoever this person is, it seems, I'm guessing, that there's somebody who tries to sell parents on the idea that everything that their kids do is their responsibility. Like, if your kids are having a hard time, it's because you're not dealing with them properly. And, there's a lot of experts who try to sell this myth to parents that, oh, your children only struggle or suffer or feel pain because you're doing something wrong. And therefore, if you learn how to do it right, your children will never suffer, and they'll always be happy and content and do everything that everybody wants them to do.
Would you like me to read you the tweet? Because I've pulled it up.
Yeah.
Okay. It says, this notion that kids are holding it in, freeing themselves all day, as if schools are some form of punishment, that in a preschool. Learning is fun. Is children are are you?
Sorry, you're breaking up again there. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Can you, like, put it up as do you know how to do a banner on the StreamYard? And then we can just see it on the screen, like copy and paste it. Because I would ask you to read it again, but I would hate it if it stuttered again, and then I'm just asking.
I don't think I have access to that here.
Shoot. Okay, well, let's try reading it one more time.
What I might do is leave the studio.
Okay.
One more time. And then I might leave the studio and come back. So I might need you to let me back.
Why don't you do that now, and I'll just vamp for a minute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. All right.
I'll just talk, because I honestly don't know if I think she just left. She's going to be joining back in. Of what I heard. And if you're in the chat, let me know if it's, I assume that stuttering is happening for everyone, not just me, but if it's just on my end, let me know and I can adjust. But of what I heard of the tweet that she was reading, I heard the idea that school, like, that the person writing the tweet seems to be taking issue with an idea that school is a punishment, which I would also take issue with. I don't think that school is a punishment, but that also doesn't mean that school isn't unpleasant, or for a given individual that it is, a net unpleasantness, right? Kind of a big part of what we're always trying to talk about is that everything which is valuable also has a cost associated with it. There's this idea that things are either good or bad is too simplistic. Things which are beneficial are also costly. And of course, things are costly which are not beneficial, although in that case, we're getting into some semantic stuff where I would say that it's either that anything you're spending cost on is valuable, but sometimes the value we're talking about is the avoidance of some worse fate or state or condition or whatever, right? That it's not like, oh, I'm paying this heavy cost to get something awesome, but I'm paying this heavy cost to avoid having something terrible happen. So no, I don't think school is a punishment. I also think a lot of this, so there's a term operant conditioning, that the basic concept of operant conditioning is so suffused throughout our entire culture, especially around children, parenting, educating children, all that stuff, but really everywhere, that we forget to check on how that might be influencing our thinking. I'm a little bit vamping, but I actually do find this stuff fascinating, and hopefully it's helpful. And if you have any questions or thoughts, put them in the chat. But behavioral stuff, which it sounds like this person is, when we're talking about behavioral stuff, that work kind of originates in the work of Pavlov and then later on B.F. Skinner. Hi, Marie. I'll put you back in. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, can you hear me?
I can. Let's try this again. Let's try reading that tweet and see if this time it works out okay.
Okay. So the tweet says, this notion that kids are holding in from being themselves all day, as if schools are some form of punishment, is absurd. Have you ever sat in a preschool? Learning is fun, playtime is fun, and socialization is fun. Children are unapologetically themselves. Who are you fooling?
All right. So I'll give my thoughts, and just with the caveat that part of the reason I don't do a lot on social media is because the brevity that is required of the format makes it so that you can't really say much with nuance. So it could be that whoever this person is would say, yes, it's a lot more nuanced than this, but they just can't fit it into whatever that message is. But here are some of the issues there. I was saying when you were resetting, I was saying I would agree that school is not a punishment. Punishment is a particular term from operant conditioning, which means something that a person is doing to create a negative experience for some other person in order to modify that person's behavior, specifically in order to attempt to extinguish some behavior. You do something, I punish you, that which means either I create some negative experience for you, or I take away or withhold some positive experience from you. Either way, I'm making things worse, in the hopes that you will associate the behavior you just engaged in with the punishment, and therefore eventually will stop doing, or decrease the amount you're doing that behavior in order to avoid the punishment, right? And school is obviously not that. It's not something that we are doing to kids because they've done something we don't like. Now, school can be unpleasant, and I would say it is absurd to say that learning is fun as a blanket statement. And again, I would assume whoever this is would acknowledge that it's more nuanced than that, but they're just trying to make a particular point. Learning can be fun. Learning can also be miserable. Like we say all the time, oh, well, what you just experienced was terrible and awful, and we wish you didn't have to experience it, but hey, at least you learned something, right? Like, learning, there's nothing about learning inherently which is fun. Now, if they're specifically referring to like the academic environment or the environment of a preschool or whatever, then maybe they're just using the term learning to sub in for some other thing. But even then, you can love school, you can love academics generally. There's still going to be experiences that you have at school that are miserable for you. You're going to get into a conflict with another kid. You're gonna pride yourself on being able to do everything correctly, and then one day you won't do something correctly and you'll feel terrible for that reason. it's not all good stuff. So again, we're back to things can be valuable and they also have a cost. It's not so simple.
Right.
So I would, if I was trying to guess what this person's really trying to say, is they are interpreting other people's messages to be saying that basically school is bad. And this person is saying, no, school is not bad, school is good. And bad and good is just too simplistic of a way to look at it. So
I think they did follow up to say that they had a more nuanced take on it on a different social media platform, and that people should go read that instead.
See, this is the thing about social media, though, to me, is if you're going to put something out there that you know can't be fully nuanced, then you also have to be prepared for people to be upset with the lack of nuance and say, yep, you're right. It's more nuanced than I said. I just couldn't say it. Instead of being like, no, I swear I got it right. Just check this other thing. And again, maybe that I don't engage on social media, so I'm not going to judge or criticize other people for how they do it. But yes, the basic underlying premise of that, the idea that, like, were they responding to a particular claim of like kids who do well at school behaviorally and then get home and melt down, that's not because they're holding it in? Because that tweet doesn't say anything.
I don't. It wasn't a response to anything, so I don't know where the thought originated from. It was a standalone tweet.
I would generally like embrace the attempted message, if I'm parsing it correctly, of like, let's not treat school like it's some awful, like, terrible punishment that we're sending kids off to, because it isn't intended to be a punishment. It isn't a punishment. But again, that doesn't mean that there's not things that we can improve on, or that for particular children it can be more unpleasant, or even overall a net unpleasantness or lack of safety. And I don't want that to sound like I'm saying, oh, educators are bad or blah, 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 or anything. Because even if the administration and the teachers are doing everything that they can do to make it a wonderful experience, maybe the other kids in your class aren't. And even if they are, like we talk all the time about the like former gifted kid syndrome on social media, right? That even if everything's going super duper well for you in all observable ways, that can create its own sense of stress and internalized pressure. And, oh gosh, I must be. One of the reasons I think that Encanto was such a hit for so many people, like resonated so much with so many people, that the Disney movie from a couple years back, is because that's pretty much, there's no villain, right? Like the conflict of that movie is people who objectively from the outside have been given all this wonderful stuff that nobody else has been given, acknowledging and stating out loud the internal strife that comes with that it can be hard to reconcile, to look at someone and be like, wow, their life looks so perfect compared to mine. And then also acknowledge that, well, even they struggle, and maybe those struggles are associated with the fact that they know that their life is perfect compared to mine, and that makes them feel as though they owe me. We can't make anything a perfectly enjoyable experience, which, I mean, if we're really going to talk about learning, again, that's an umbrella term that can mean a lot of different things. But the kind of like directed learning, as opposed to latent learning, like learning through play. Because if we're using learning in that way, latent learning is the idea that just as you do something, you'll learn about that thing, right? That if I asked you to draw a map of your local neighborhood, you probably could, even though you've never studied that in any didactic way. You just, as you go about your life, pick up pieces of things and it kind of goes together. So that's latent learning. And if we're talking about latent learning, then literally everything is latent, involves latent learning, or latent learning happens during anything else. So then it would be absurd to say that it's always fun, because not everything is always fun, and you learn from those things too. But if we're talking about academic learning, guided learning, where we're saying we want you to learn a particular thing and we're going to measure how much you've learned it, whatever, then in that case, no, it cannot be only fun, because there must be some incentive for the brain to learn it. There must be some idea that it will be beneficial for me to learn the thing, which could be that not learning the thing is no problem, but it's better if I learn it. Or it could be, learning the thing doesn't matter, but if I don't learn it, that's a big problem. Or it could be both. But either way, there's a disparity, which then creates some stress. And the response to that stress is the learning. Ooh, I should learn this thing, and then I learn it. If I have no reason, it doesn't affect my life anyway, either way, then cognitive Meister theory, the brain doesn't spend any resources trying to learn. But again, I would go back to that my first response, I think is the most relevant for what we're talking about, which is just you're not holding it in. We just limited people. We do our best to do all the things that we think are good to do, which is going to which is going to always include some sense of what we think other people who we respect and value would want from us, but sometimes goes beyond that into just what anybody in front of us would want from us. We default to that, right? Like when I'm walking past a bunch of strangers on the street, it's not like I have a particular respect and knowledge of any individual one of them, but I still, if I had an impulse to do a thing that might cause them some discomfort, I'm still probably going to override that impulse, right? Not always, but it's at least a factor that weighs in that direction. We care about making each other comfortable by design, like evolutionary. It's our survival mechanism. So just let go of this idea that a thing is good or bad, including that the child is behaving in a good way at school and a bad way at home. It is what it is. It might be. One of my challenges to staff all the time is to stop using the terms good or bad, because they're just such large umbrella terms and they're always debatable. So if you're saying a thing is bad, use a more specific term that falls under that umbrella. It's bad, it's unpleasant, it's undesirable, it's harmful, it's costly, it's annoying, it's terrifying, it's whatever. Like, be more specific about in what particular way you mean that it is bad, and same with good. But yeah, there are costs. We all know that. You go to a party that's all formal and fancy and you do a good job, and then after you go home, you're like, oh, okay, I gotta relax.
Yeah. And I mean, it's the same for kids, and kids don't have the language to explain. I'm in sensory overload. I need some time out. So, so maybe they get through the day, they do all the things that are expected of them. They have fun with their friends, but they're completely wiped when they get home. And then the meltdown happens because they've run out of battery, or they feel safe to have a meltdown. I don't know.
Yeah, that can be a lot of things. I bet a really common one that happens in circumstances like this is they get home and parents say, okay, time to do your homework right after school.
Yeah.
If we rest and recharge, then maybe we have something to do homework later on. But when you just got through all that, because again, it's not just the kids lack this language, but grown-ups, those of us who are even very well versed in this stuff, we don't always think of things in this way. I don't say like, I'm angry. Probably I worked too hard earlier today and pushed myself too much. We say, I'm angry because of this thing that just happened that I'm angry about. We don't say, oh, I'm tired. I probably pushed too hard today. We might do that sometimes, but it's far more common for someone to say, oh, I'm tired. I really should go to bed early tonight. I didn't get enough sleep last night.
Yeah.
Because generally people don't look at cost. That's why stuff like this happens. They're just debating, is school valuable or not valuable? And either position in the extreme is obviously a ridiculous thing. It is valuable and costly. And sometimes the value is just, if I don't do it, people will beat me or whatever terrible thing. When I say value, I don't necessarily mean positive. I just mean it's worth spending the cost on. So yeah, I hate this concept. Here's my big question. Without swearing, what in the world does anybody mean be themselves? What does that mean? How would anyone assess whether a person is being themselves or not being themselves? Like, even for yourself, I'm not even talking about just evaluating a kid. For you yourself, what would you say is the distinction between, right now I'm being myself and right now I am not being myself? Uh-oh.
Can you hear me okay?
I hear you now, but your image is frozen. And
Yeah,
then I lost you.
at least it's not frozen on a weird expression. Or maybe it is. Yeah, that's a really good question. I guess this is where the idea of masking comes in, and I think that was the response um, on Twitter from a lot of people that you know we're masking all day and then we're exhausted by the time we get home. But yeah, as to what counts as being yourself,
And
we
couldn't
we
we
never
say,
reach the bottom of that.
you're right. And whatever a person means by masking, and I think
Yeah.
that's, again, like all things which are valuable, they are limited and they are not useful past the limits of their utility, right? Masking is a useful concept that does get applied past the limits of its utility and gets therefore applied in ways which are not useful. Uh, but no matter what the person means who's saying that, couldn't we say that, well, you who are yourself is determining that in that moment it is worth masking, right? Like, do we just mean doing something that I would not otherwise have done if I was not in the presence of this person? Because then, isn't that like anything? Like anything you do in the presence of any person is not a thing you would have done exactly the same way if that person had not been there. So it gets used a lot to just mean pretending to be normal, pretending to
Yeah.
be neurotypical, which is a useful way to apply the term, but then also raises all kinds of questions about what the hell are we talking about normal? What do you mean? How do you know, for example, that what person would we look at who's interacting with other people and say that person is not attempting to communicate in a way that they think everyone else around them will understand? Right?
Hmm.
So to me, this is one of those places where the language of neurodiversity gets used to actually talk about the deficit model, as though some of us mask and some of us don't. And that's true if we're defining it specifically as, if what we mean by mask is attempt to hide the fact that I'm neurodivergent.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, you're only doing that if you identify yourself as being neurodivergent and feel like there would be some negative consequence for other people recognizing that in you. But if by mask we just mean, you know, speak or interact with other people in some other way than my default response would be because I think they won't really understand what I'm saying. Like we all translate our thoughts into language that we speak out loud. And so I do think sometimes when the neurodiversity language gets applied to this kind of us and them thing,
Mm-hmm.
it's not neurodiversity. That's not, language is used for what it's used for. But it becomes problematic, it becomes tribal, and it becomes deficit language. It's anyway.
Yes, because neurodiversity, that term encompasses all of us. It's
Right.
about the diversity within the human species,
Yeah.
not just a subset of that species.
The core premise of neurodiversity, the paradigm, the lens, the worldview of neurodiversity is every single person has a unique brain, neurological structure, whatever. And that because our experiences, our behaviors, our perceptions are at least to some extent impacted by the neurological structure of our brain, that those things are also unique. So no, there is not like an amalgamation of 80% of the people in the world are normal and therefore exactly the same, but 20% of us are different. And it's not that I'm saying be nice to neurotypical people, because again, neurotypical is a term that has utility if what we mean by that is a person who has not been identified by themselves or anyone else as neurodivergent. It's like saying, I don't know, if we think of it as centering neurodivergence, which is an identity label, and therefore we use neurotypical to mean anyone who does not have the identity label of neurodivergent, useful term. But it's, to me, very dangerous that just is very prone to getting interpreted as normal, most people, typical, average. And that gets equated to, oh, they have such an easy time of it. no one understands how difficult my life is. And I'll say this, you're right, no one understands how difficult your life is. But that's not because other people's lives are not difficult. They're just difficult in different ways. And I'm not saying everyone's life is exactly the same amount of difficult, although how the hell would you measure that? Like, if internal distress counts, then how are we going to compare? And also, why do we need to? Because to me, again, that's deficit model. Well, mine is worse than yours, therefore I am entitled to certain resources and interventions and whatever that you are not, because yours isn't as bad as mine. Well, the whole argument you're making there is that I have a terrible thing I have to deal with that you do not have to deal with. That's a deficit. Even if it also comes with some nice things, right? It's still a deficit.
Yeah.
You know, like if you're blind, your other senses are heightened is a relatively accepted concept. But we would still look at blindness and say, well, that's a deficit. That's a thing, you know, a disability, whatever. You're not looking to make that trade generally.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if what your claim is my life is in some total worse and harder than your life, no one's going to make that trade. Why would they want their life to be worse? Which means that that's a deficit. You're just saying because of the way you are, your life is worse. And using neurodiversity language doesn't change the fact that you're conceptualizing it that way.
Yeah.
It leads to what I think are honestly very frivolous arguments like this. They're really so hard to acknowledge that it costs a lot for people to get through certain things, and different people cost more or less for getting through different kinds of things, and that we all have experiences of pushing ourselves to get through something where we don't see a better option, or it just seems normal and we don't have the idea or whatever, and then crashing on the other end of it. So the fact that that's going to happen for some kids, of course. And does that mean school is a terrible thing that we shouldn't put kids into? No. Does it mean school is perfect and always awesome? No. Like, just why are we arguing about it?
I wonder when people are talking about the experience of masking in school, if they're talking about not being able to, or not feeling comfortable enough to stim in a way that helps them self-regulate, because maybe that's behavior that stands out that a teacher or whoever might tell them to stop doing, stop fidgeting, stop kicking the table, stop swinging in your chair. And maybe that's something we can talk about in terms of accommodations and how we make it so that kids can stim comfortably in class, or alternatives that we could suggest, or that you could suggest.
What a great transition. And yeah, I'm sure that's partly what people mean by it sometimes, is not feeling free to stim. Although, again, we could phrase that differently. We could say that a person, sometimes they're not feeling free to stim, so they don't attempt it. Sometimes they start doing whatever thing is a stim for them and they're told to stop. And so they just legitimately are not free to stim without certain consequences. And as opposed to the meltdown being, and you didn't say it this way, but I just want to clarify for people that might interpret it, that we're not necessarily saying that because I'm not free to stim, I'm utilizing some other resources deliberately that I will then like have to stim and make up for later on. It's just stimming serves a purpose, and not being able to do something that meets that purpose means that it goes unmet. And stimming in particular is a self-regulation thing. Now, again, I'm going to say some stuff that might be controversial. So just, I hope people keep in mind when I'm talking about neurodiversity, it's some people are neurodivergent and some people are not. We're all different. Mm-hmm. Because stimming is one of those things that everybody does, but people generally only talk about it in reference to autism. When it's something that someone's doing and they have ADHD, we'll generally call it fidgeting instead, even though it's very similar, if not the same, at least sometimes.
I'm doing it right now with my putty.
I'm doing it with my fingers and my mug, if anyone can see it. It's cold here today, so it's nice to feel like I'm pressing my fingernails against the mug and like pressing them against each other and stuff. So it's not something that you only do if you're autistic. It's something that anybody does. Because if you just think of it, no, okay, let me clarify. Stimming, the word specifically, like the official definition of it, is from autism, like the discussion of autism. And so it is in that sense specifically about autistic people. But in that sense, it is also only used officially to mean repetitive physical behaviors. So hand flapping is like the very commonly thought of one, and rocking. But most people, especially most people online who are involved with neurodiversity, would make the claim that there are other forms of stimming, right? Vocal stimming, and echolalia is a version of stimming, and et cetera, et cetera. So acknowledging that that's like the official whatever, but that's not what we're talking about. The question that has to be asked is, why does stimming help regulate somebody? Because if we accept that deficit model thing of, well, autistic people stim to regulate themselves and non-autistic people don't, then we don't have to ask why it works. We say it works because they're autistic. That's just a thing. That's just how autistic people are. They stim and it helps them regulate, which is a nonsense answer, because part of how you get diagnosed as being autistic is that you stim. So saying, well, they stim because they're autistic and they're autistic because they stim, at least in part, doesn't mean anything. I think it's useful to think of it as this. We have finite attentional resources and finite working memory resources. Attention is kind of time gated, right? Like that in any given moment, only so much can be admitted into conscious awareness, and everything else, even though the brain would love to have all that information, it just can't. I think of it like the pipeline, the bandwidth, the conduit, the gate, right? Like it's only so big, only so much can fit in at a time. Working memory is short-term storage. It is where we hold information that has not been encoded into long-term memory. It's where we retrieve information from long-term memory into, the technical definition is that cognitive space in which we can hold information that we can manipulate. We can hold information in long-term memory, but we can't actually cognitively do anything with it. It's frozen. If we're doing something with, because again, it's not like these are spaces, right? This is the long-term memory and this is the working memory. We got to retrieve it over here to over here. It just means whatever you're conscious of. So if you're thinking of a long-term memory, you are now conscious of it. That information is still there when you're not thinking of it, but you're not doing anything with it. You're not thinking of it, right? So that's where we keep information that's useful. So things come in through attention, and then we have processes that kind of prioritize what stuff is worth paying attention to. And then in working memory, we have processes that determine what things get held on to and what things get rejected, how long we hold on to the things we hold on to, what things they might call up from long-term memory in association with them, etc. So when you're walking down the street, you do likely pay attention to other people walking on the street in your direction, if for no other reason than to navigate around them. Not always. Sometimes we're not doing that consciously. We're focused on something else, but pretty frequent that we're going to notice someone, pay attention to them for just a moment, and then they're out of our working memory. We don't keep thinking about them. So stimming has to do with sensitivities, to me. I think this is the useful way to look at it, and getting back to accommodations, because there's unofficial stuff you can do here too. That if I am having an intense experience in my internal, conscious, subjective experience, right? Like an emotion, a thought, stuff that isn't about the physical environment, even if it was sparked by or originated in the physical environment. But at this point, it's now here. And because we have finite resources, it is possible to get to a place where all of those resources are consumed by something happening in your cognitive space, and you cannot even notice anything in the physical environment. We call that sometimes flashbacks, depending on the kind of thing that's happening. We call it daydreams, depending on the kind of thing that's happening. We call it meltdown, depending on what's happening, right? Mm-hmm. Well, we don't have a mechanism that allows us to decrease the amount of attention and working memory, the amount of resources generally that are going to something consciously. We can't say, stop thinking about this, because that is a thought about this. All we can do is pull those resources elsewhere, which diminishes the amount that are available for that thing. So stimming to me is this. Stimming is, it's so intense in the internal environment that I'm doing something that calls my attention to the external physical environment. But I have to do it in a way that isn't problematic, which is difficult because the things that mostly call our attention are problematic. And especially if what's happening up here is problematic, then we're mostly not going to pay attention to anything else unless it's even more potentially problematic than this. That's where we rely on sensitivities. For whatever reason, I have a tactile sensitivity that even if it's not a problem to push my fingernails against the mug, it does call my attention to it. So to me, that's what makes stimming, that something in here is really intense and I'm doing anything that draws my attention out to the external environment instead, it decreases the intensity, because we stim even when we're experiencing intensely positive emotions. We're too happy and too excited, right? My eldest son is like the most noticeable stim is that he hops up and down. He does the hand flap a little bit when he hops up and down, but not always. He mostly does that when he gets really happy and really excited. So it's about diminishing the intensity.
Yeah.
And when you think about it that way, then all of a sudden it becomes very clear that this is a stim. That this is a stim. Right. That this is a stim. That this is a stim. That if I don't know this is a stim, and et cetera, et cetera. We all do these things.
Brandon, just to stop you, your audio is kind of coming, it sounds like you're underwater at times. Oh, why that might be.
Shoot. Has that been happening this whole time or it just started?
It just started.
I don't know why, but let me move my microphone closer to where I'm sitting and see if that helps. I just checked to make sure the settings are still the same. I don't know. Maybe something with noise cancellation or something. Started thinking I was in the background. Now, what I would call fidgeting is similar thing, but more preventative. As opposed to decreasing the intensity of an internal experience, what I'm doing when I'm fidgeting is some of my attention goes to the thing because I have a sensitivity to it, which means I prioritize that data even when it isn't necessarily useful or problematic. But instead of, because it's so intense, I'm doing it to decrease my experience. It's just, it takes up some of my attention. It goes into working memory and it's useless data. It's not novel. It's not problematic. It's not valuable for any task that I'm approaching. I notice it, it goes through attention, but then it immediately gets dismissed from working memory, which is why it helps me focus, because it keeps more of my working memory available. In other words, if I wasn't doing that, then instead of the attentional resources passing through some data about whatever I'm fidgeting with, it would be something else that gets passed in. And whatever else gets passed in might be novel, might be problematic, might seem relevant. And therefore, once it hits working memory, it stays there or even starts to pull things up from long-term memory and take up a bunch of room and get me distracted and et cetera. But if I'm doing this, or as people, I don't even know, where did I put my Rubik's Cube? So that'll be a fun mystery. Someone saw me on stream, I'm sure put it down somewhere. Oh, it's over on the desk. I was doing my little fidgeting with that. So they're different things, but very similar. To me, I've made up those definitions, those ways of conceptualizing it. So I don't want to make it sound like this is research-based or like widely accepted or whatever. But to me, those explanations are, I don't like not having an explanation for something. When someone says stimming helps people regulate, I want to know why. And really, this was about 2 years ago that I was just, for weeks, being like, why the hell is that supposed to do what they say it's supposed to do? We can observe that it does it, but why? And eventually came around to like constructing this explanation, which tracks to me. I don't know, maybe other people, and I would love it if anyone finds flaws in that and would point them out to me, I would love it, because I'm always looking to refine my understanding. Anyway, in terms of accommodations, what does that mean? What that means is you don't need accommodations to stim or to fidget. You might need official accommodations to stim or fidget in a particular way, right? That if, for example, standing up and pacing around is a stim or a fidget for you, then your your particular educational environment might not allow that, but if you have an accommodation for it, they might. Or if you fidget with toys, certain kinds of toys like Maria is doing right now, right? But you can, that wasn't a call. I hope that didn't sound like I was like calling you
No,
out. Just, but without going through any official channels, in fact, without even attempting to communicate directly with the teacher or whoever, whatever authority figure is in charge of the environment, you can attempt to find replacement stims and fidgets using this framework, right? If we think of it not as hand flapping regulates me because hand flapping regulates me, but rather hand flapping regulates me because it draws my attention because I have a sensitivity to that kind of kinesthetic and proprioception data of where my body parts are, then I might start to do, this instead, where it won't be as ostentatious or whatever, or, little finger tricks or whatever, or even just rubbing my fingers together back and forth, or you can experiment with different things. Now, is not always going to work. You might think, oh, I do this thing as a stim. That probably means I'm sensitive to X kind of data, but we got it wrong. It was some other kind of data or whatever, or my whole theory is wrong anyway, or whatever. Or B, you might come up with other stuff that way that does work, but doesn't work as well as the original. And sometimes but even then, that means that when things aren't as dire, you can use the stuff that doesn't work as well, and therefore only graduate to using the stuff that works as well, that was causing you whatever problem in that social environment when necessary. So it's still going to diminish the conflict, as opposed to not doing anything because the only thing I know to do is that thing. Really, when you think of it this way, start picturing all the things that you see people do in the classroom, in the office environment, and in social situations where they're not, where it's not socially approved to just be doing whatever you want to do. Biting on my pencil flipping tricks, right? Like humming under my breath, mouthing words even though I'm not speaking out loud, blinking even. I mean, all different kinds of things. Those are all serving the same purpose. Notice that, call them a nervous tick or whatever. And a lot of these things we do say, well, they're licking their lips a lot. That must mean they're nervous. They're twirling their hair. That must mean they're nervous. Which, separately, but related and I think relevant, note that the things that are associated with traditionally feminine things, like twirling hair, because that associates with long hair, which is traditionally feminine in our culture, tend to get viewed as a representation that someone is feeling uncertain, childish, nervous, something like that. Whereas the same things that are associated with traditionally masculine things in our culture, like having a beard, this is pensive, this is serious and thoughtful. I'm still literally just twirling hair right around like the same area of my face. Yeah. But this shows I'm not a serious person, and this means I'm a very serious person. Anyway, you can find replacement stims and replacement fidgets. You can experiment with that. Next, then I would say you go to the teacher and talk about unofficial stuff without having to, because going through the official process is a pain in the ass. It takes a long time. Obviously do it if it is helpful, but if we can get the value that we would get by going through that process without going through that process, let's get it. So, I just try the easier at first. Something I talk to people about all the time, and I got to get going relatively soon, but eye contact, for example. We got to teach people how to make eye contact. And then we'll all say, no, that's ABA, that's behavioralism. We shouldn't. We should take into account how uncomfortable they are. Cool. Yes, agreed. But then even people who are saying that will also then say things like, we should teach them that it is disrespectful when you don't look at somebody in the eye. But okay, that's better. It's even better to say, no, we should teach them that some people, if not many people, will interpret it as a sign of disrespect, which is better. And even better than that is, to me, I say, okay, yes, let's talk about the fact that many people will interpret it as a sign of disrespect. But again, more importantly than that, because I am autistic myself, I don't know, that seems to be a way of explaining my thinking process here. I want to be able to know why and explain and categorize things. We want to talk about, why is it viewed as being disrespectful? Not because a behavior is a binary disrespectful or not disrespectful thing, but because if you're not looking at me, then I might think that you are not paying attention to me and therefore don't value what it is that I have to say. Because then I can remember that better. Instead of just a bunch of rules, what are things that are disrespectful and not disrespectful? Somebody teach me all these unspoken rules as though they exist. No, it makes sense. I can understand it. And then we teach people, okay, you can work on, like we were talking about earlier, masking, pushing yourself to make eye contact when it's important that you give the appearance of being attentive for whatever reason, and just deal with the fact that it costs you what it costs you later on or whatever. We can teach them little tricks. Look at the middle of the bridge of their nose, and that way it's not like eye contact, whatever. Or my preference is, I have yet to meet someone who has that uncomfortable experience with eye contact who is not very sensitive to social data. Everyone I have spoken with who is uncomfortable with eye contact always has said that the reason it's uncomfortable is because it's like too intimate. I'm getting too much information. Maybe it's just distracting me from what I'm trying to think about. What it's looking at someone's eyes. There's a reason we say the eyes are the window of the soul. I'm not trying to be mystic. There's a lot of little muscles here where we're evolved. It communicates a lot of data.
Right.
So sensitivity, it's like if I'm sensitive to sound and a loud sound plays, it's a lot, even though other people are fine with it, right? It's not because it's a harmful experience, it's because it's a very sensitive experience. And I can say this, I teach people to say this, I am aware, so I'm kind of uncomfortable with eye contact, and I'm aware that people sometimes view that as being disrespectful or that it means that I'm not listening. But the truth is that for me, if I'm making eye contact, it's so uncomfortable for me that I can't really hear what a person is saying. So it's so important to me to hear what you have to say that I'm not going to make eye contact with you. I'm going to take the risk that you will think that I am disrespectful or inattentive, because I would rather risk that but still actually hear what you're saying than pretend as though I'm listening to you but not actually get any of it. And then all of a sudden, even the people who have a big problem with, eye contact's disrespectful, now they're like, ooh, and they have no problem with it. Now, it's a big ask for someone to have to explain it. I'm not saying we should do that in all cases. You just have your options. So the more awareness you get, then you can talk to professors and teachers and explain. And by and large, educators are nice, attentive, caring people who do want to help the people under their charge, and they will try to accommodate you. Now, some stims and some fidgets are disruptive. It's not socially approved. It's about, no, if you do that, it makes it difficult for everyone else to focus. If you're going to say, well, I have a auditory sensitivity, so if someone next to me is clacking their teeth, like, I don't want them to do that because it makes it hard for me to focus. That's a valid thing.
Mm-hmm.
What about if that person's saying, well, clacking my teeth is a stim and I should be able to do my stim even if other people are uncomfortable? We have to accommodate for other people as much as we can. So we deal with the reality of it and go beyond this dumbass binary of everyone should let you do whatever stim you want all the time, because you wouldn't let anyone else do whatever stim they want all the time. There are things that impact other people, and we want to take that into account.
Yeah.
And then as a last resort, we talk about those things through official accommodations, because honestly, official accommodations, the only ones I've ever seen for stuff like that is letting people get up and wander around, being able to play with fidget toys, or different kinds of seating arrangements, getting a wobble seat, or, being able to sit off by themselves or by the window or whatever. And those things can help, but stimming and fidgeting is a situational thing. It's not something you do all the time, always, right? Another thing that's very similar that wouldn't be under like stimming and fidgeting is being able to leave the classroom and go to like a sensory, certain kind of environment or whatever. And yeah, those things can be helpful, but just same with the question I always get from people in the workplace: how do I get accommodations without having to reveal that I have X, Y, or Z? Start with, see if you can just figure out some replacement stuff that doesn't cause the problem that the initial stuff causes, but still gives you the benefit. If not, then see if you can go explain it in terms and request it without explaining it at all. Hey, it helps me to be able to pace while I think. A lot of people are not going to ask a question about that. You don't have to say, helps me to pace while I think because X, Y, and Z. But if they do ask for reasoning, you can find other reasoning to give besides just because I have ADHD or because I'm autistic. And you only go to that stuff as a last resort. Because like we were talking about with the work stuff, there's an implied threat of legal action. if you're jumping to that, even if you don't mean it, they might interpret it to mean,
Yeah.
better let me do this or I will sue you, even if that's not what you mean.
And for parents and caregiver kids, I guess the same thing applies. Like if they've got a sensory sensitivity, if they're very tactile, I'm a fluffy pencils. See if there can be modifications made to the school uniform if there's a uniform requirement. I guess things like that.
Replacement stuff, help them explore different things that can be done. I mean, this is all stuff that we do by nature. We just don't always use this language with it, right? That like,
Yeah.
oh, my kid does X at school and they got in trouble for it, even though it's not a bad thing. Well, I'm going to sit and talk and say like, okay, can we do some other thing to meet that same purpose? I won't use that language, but you know, I know you love making people laugh, but when you're making jokes while the teacher's talking, it's disruptive. Are there other things we can do? You know, kind of stuff.
Yeah.
I got to get going. This was fun. We could do a whole thing on sensitivities, a whole thing on stimming and fidgeting, etc. But I got to go.
Okay, it's been good to be with you. Technical difficulties notwithstanding.
Yeah.
And I look forward to chatting with you next week.
I will see you next week. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Bye, everybody. Feel free to contact us on Twitter or Facebook if you've got any questions. Bye.